Tinakotu, Tinakotu, Tinakotu Katoa. Welcome to Aotearoa for our international guests. We do things a little bit differently down here than perhaps you're used to. You will hear Te Reo Maori during this webinar, as well as English. And we start hui, or meetings here, usually with a karakia, or a blessing. Normally we would have someone local do that today, but we're fortunate today to have Shamika Goddard with us, who is of course a chaplain. So I would like to invite her to conduct today's blessing, and then we'll get started. Shamika?
Thank you. Let the strength and life force of our ancestors be with each and every one of us, freeing our path from obstruction so that our words, spiritual power, love, and language are upheld, permanently fixed, established, and understood, forward together. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Those of you here as attendees will have had a code of conduct emailed to you. Do review that, and it applies to the Q&A. So if you could try and all be kind and pleasant, that's the sort of webinar that we're having today. For those of you who aren't familiar with Tohatoha, we're a small nonprofit that grew out of the Creative Commons chapter here in New Zealand. And what we do is we support schools and libraries with copyright and Creative Commons licensing, as well as moving toward looking at justice in the digital space and what that looks like. So we've been part of the open community here for over 10 years. And we've only recently started moving toward a broader understanding of our role here and the digital world, and what kind of digital world that we would like. I would also very much like to thank Internet New Zealand. We're fortunate to be able to have the kind of panel where we can afford to actually pay people to attend and to pay people for their mahi. And we're able to do that because Internet New Zealand has made that possible. They're a registered charity. They support the .nz domain. And what they do with those funds is help small organizations like ours, small community groups, put on events like this and do it in a way that supports the work that's being done by the women who are joining us here today. So thank you to Internet New Zealand. If you're interested in joining Internet New Zealand, you definitely should. They're a wonderful organization. So the plan for the event today is we're going to let each of our three panelists talk. Christina's book, Hacking Diversity, The Politics of Inclusion and Open Cultures. She's going to discuss that. Shamika is going to discuss her work as a tech chaplain and on Techno Womanism. And Heeni will discuss her work in the digital sovereignty space. I'm delighted that they could join us all today to start the process of breaking out from the binary open-closed conversation and move us more toward a conversation about justice and technology. The way this is going to work is each speaker will talk, then they'll review the Q&A for clarifying questions, but we'll reserve most of the time at the end for questions. The accessibility features today, there will be captioning available after the event, and we'll post that on Twitter and our website so that you'll be able to view it there. We will be tight on time today, so it's unlikely that we're going to be able to get to everyone's questions, but we are going to do our best. If you would like to ask a question, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see Q&A. The little button marked Q&A, if you type on that, the panelists and I will be able to see. I would also like to thank Brendan, Kiara, and Chris, who are here today to help with tech, just in case something goes wrong so that I can focus on moderating and not also having to do the tech. So thanks so much to them. We are recording this session, so nothing you're doing as an attendee will be on screen, but the rest of us will be. Let's see, is there anything else? The chat is going to be closed today. I don't think that we have the sort of capacity to monitor a chat and to monitor a Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead here and introduce Christina. Christina Dunbar-Hester is the author of Hacking Diversity, The Politics of Inclusion and Open Technology Cultures, put out by Princeton University Press just this year. She's also written a book called Low Power to the People, Pirates, Protest and Politics in FM Radio Activism. That came out from MIT in 2014. She's a faculty member in the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and she holds a PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Cornell University. Her writing and research centers on the politics of technology and culture, especially media and tech activisms, infrastructures, and ecno-technological sites. Christina, I will hand things over to you now.
Thank you. I think I'm unmuted. Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone who's out there in the audience whom I can't see, but all over the globe, I think. I want to thank my fellow panelists, Shamika for the blessing, Tohatoha for the infrastructural support and the invitation, and Mandy in particular for reaching out to me. As Mandy said, I'm going to talk a little bit about this new book, Hacking Diversity, which is a study of voluntaristic hacking and free libre open source software cultures, and specifically the topic of advocacy around diversity in those cultures. I will situate myself a little bit and point out that I'm not a practitioner of hacking or free software. My role here is I'm more of an interpreter, so I'm going in to do research and listen to conversations and document and chart activities in these communities and then write about them. And the book addresses both members of those communities and scholars from where I sit. I'll also note that the research is cited in North America and Europe, and there are places where that research sort of touches other places on Earth, and I do write about that as much as I can in the book, but that's where I'm sitting in this presentation and in the book. What I'm going to do in this talk is distill a little bit of the book briefly. First, I'm going to go over some of what has been happening, and then I'm going to talk about why it's been happening in the sort of minds of the people who are pursuing this diversity advocacy. And then I'm going to talk briefly about some lessons we might take away from that. And I'm going to show a few slides to enliven the text and give you, I hope, a better idea of exactly what the kind of thing I was looking at in this book. Before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the historical background and the period of the book. In 2006, approximately, the EU had published an economic study about free software. So the research is a couple of years older than that. And when it came out, it, based on the research, claimed that the rate of participation by women in free software was less than 2%. And so people, I think, found that pretty shocking. Like they knew that the rate of participation of women versus men wasn't equal, but they didn't realize it was that low. And that number was even lower than other computing cultures, academic, computer science, and industry. And so that research finding galvanized a bunch of actions and conversations in hacking and free software communities. And that is the period that this book looks at, sort of entering into those conversations as people are mobilizing around this matter. So without further ado then, I'm going to get into talking about some of what those actions were. And for that, I'm going to share my screen, which looks like it has been disabled. Can somebody?
Yep, working on that right now.
Great.
Let's see here.
Thank you.
Okay, you should be able to.
Okay, I think we're doing it. Wait. Sorry, what are you guys seeing?
I see a share screen and it says that all panelists can share.
Okay, are you seeing a single slide?
Nope, I'm still seeing your screen.
Okay, let me go back. Share screen.
There you go. Now you're
Better. Okay, sorry about the little glitch. Okay, here we are. Okay, so as I said, one of the things I was going to try to map out for you initially is the what of this diversity advocacy. And one of the things, because these are hackers and coders, is artifacts. So code and also craft of various kinds. And this is a piece by an artist in Philadelphia where she was motivated to take Ethernet cables and knit them into a scarf. And she described this as something she was really doing for herself, but it was also something that started conversations. And so you can see here the sort of fusing of a feminine craft skill like knitting with the domain of computing. And she displayed this in an art show and sort of used it to start conversations. Other kinds of things that were happening were interventions into governance, and Mandy mentioned the code of conduct for the meeting we're having now. Codes of conduct were also something that were getting discussed and brought into being in many of these communities. Other things were sort of interventions in the form of kind of flag planting gestures in these communities. This is a conference slide from 2010, where the person in the bottom right is a woman and has displayed this, humorous slide about, do I have to have a beard? Sort of, again, poking at the sort of normative assumption of masculinity in these spaces. And some of these folks are sort of patriarchs of free and open source. We've got Stallman and Eric Raymond and some others. And again, sort of a humorous intervention, but also sort of sharing statistics and raising consciousness about, who is in these spaces. And as I said, in the form of artifacts and in the form of interventions and governance changes. Another thing pretty common that I look at is discourse. And this quote is from the Free Software Foundation from 2012. And it is, I want to submit, pretty typical in a lot of ways. And they write, the free software movement needs diverse participation to achieve its goals. If we want to make proprietary software extinct, we need everyone on the planet to engage with free software. To get there, we need people of all genders, races, sexual orientations, and abilities leading the way. And as I said, I think this is a pretty typical quote. And we might call this discourse of representation. It gets somewhat granular about identity categories and starts naming these different categories who had been perceived to be missing. There are other threads that I pull out that are occurring alongside that have perhaps a greater political intention in them. And this artifact, excuse me, here we go. Oops, wrong one. There we go. Is a flyer from a feminist hacking convergence in 2014. And the text might be a little bit hard to see, but if you're able to see it, it says anti-racist, anti-sexist, gender hacking, anti-capitalism, libre culture, and then when I come back over to the right, DIY, DIWO. So that's sort of taking the DIY, do it yourself, out of a kind of individualist frame into doing it with others and really emphasizing collectivity and sort of process and foregrounding that. And so I want to point out here that there is a bit of a difference between the representation discourse that sort of centers on diversity in these different identity categories and some of the more fully articulated political intentions that come through in this slide. And so from there, I want to sort of just move into what I see as some of the lessons here. The discourse of representation can, the discourse of representation can sort of sit next to, but not be the same as places where you're talking more intentionally about power. And so what I wind up suggesting, I'm distilling a whole book here, is that the values and political intentions should be foregrounded. Justice is a stronger framework than diversity. And I also write about how tech itself, digital tech, is often built to uphold power relations such that it can make for a hard site to grow resistant politics. And that needs to be unpacked, especially in a milieu that we all live in, which really foregrounds tech and believes that sort of tech progress is going to be the same as other kinds of progress and collapses those two often. So I'm not saying it's an impossible place to build resistant politics, but it can be more of an uphill climb. And so for those reasons, we might want to focus on better articulating our social aims, aims that people wish to fulfill, rather than strive towards tech progress. So really just to wrap up, and I leave this as the place where we'll start having our conversation, what would happen if instead of centering tech, we centered political intentions, social aims, and brought values to the fore like anti-racism, anti-militarism, and justice. So thank you. I will now show you the thank you, Namihi slide, and get out of this view. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. I have a couple of questions for you, actually. What motivated you to study diversity discourse in open technology communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer actually looks back to my previous book, which was about people building radio stations, low power, community independent radio stations. And part of the activist practice there was the activists had a really fervent belief that demystifying technology could lead to political awakening. And so something that they were really invested in was teaching people to, you know, put their hands on the tech, not cede that power or expertise to experts. And so they wanted to teach people to solder a transmitter board or build a radio antenna. And that was really intended as a sort of radical, emancipatory, feminist practice. But when it push came to shove, it was actually something that created conflict for them, because the history of electronics tinkering in particular was laden with race, class, and gender that the radio activists wished to push against, but was actually already kind of inscribed in those cultural practices. And so that wound up being a couple of chapters in the earlier book. And then when I finished that project, I was noticing that there were these conversations emanating out of these hacking communities where they were putting that sort of squarely in the center. And I thought maybe there's, you know, a project here, and I guess there was. So yeah.
Okay, excellent. So early on in the book, you distinguish between calls for diversity and calls for justice. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and how, from your perspective, those two things can really differ?
Yeah, and again, I want to, or if I didn't say this already, I don't want to knock the work that's being done there, but I maybe want to push on it a little farther. And here, I'm leaning on work by particularly Sarah Ahmed, Herman Gray, Angela Davis, to really think about how diversity or multiculturalism in an earlier instantiation of these conversations and justice may not be the same thing. And that Sarah Ahmed writes about how diversity in institutions can even be made to reflect back whiteness if you sort of bring in people to a dominant culture but aren't actually changing that culture. It's different. Justice, on the other hand, can be a way to really center equity and equality, and there's a sort of moral overtone there, you know, having to do with power, centering power. And that's the sort of difference I want to do. And as I said, on the one hand, I'm not doing anything really groundbreaking talking about diversity versus justice, but bringing it to the tech conversation is, I think, something that I'm trying to do in that book and needs to be, you know, unpacked and looked at really carefully because we give tech so much power in our world now.
Yeah. One of the recurring themes in your book is about the tension between open communities as sites for hobbyists versus as sort of an adjunct to professional roles. Could you elaborate on how this might influence the advocacy done within and by open communities?
Yeah, this is another great question, and it may be the hardest one to answer briefly in a way, but I'll try. Yes, so there's a lot of really interesting things where, you know, hacking and free software feed into and sit alongside and also can sort of contest market relations in various ways. And other people have, you know, written about that. But one of the things that I find really interesting in this space, the book, I wind up not giving anybody their real name, giving them pseudonyms. And it was partly because sometimes when people were talking about the advocacy they were doing around diversity and sort of having hard conversations, they didn't really want to be associated necessarily with speaking for like a project or a hackerspace that they were members of. And they really didn't want to be associated with their workplaces. And there were these sort of lines where some of what people do on their spare time, if they work in tech, might be, you know, to go hack or, you know, work on a project on the weekends. But, you know, these lines were kind of blurry, and especially when it came to being sort of critical about things they could do better or talking about maybe hard stuff that had happened in their spaces or communities, they didn't want to be sort of disclosing all of that as themselves because it felt sensitive. But another thing that I noticed and argued is diversity is a very anodyne, you know, corporate concept. It's very workplace friendly, partly because it, again, leads back to market relations. If we had diverse people building products, then we can sell to diverse markets, and there's this lovely, you know, loop there. And I think that the advocates in the book are not only trying to do that. They have often, I think, intentions that are bigger and harder, but because of this sort of blurriness between the work self and the off-the-clock self, they wind up using language often that is closer to the corporate discourse and farther from discourse that we might find in like a social movement. And I argue that there are potentially consequences to those choices, even though I understand why people are making them.
Yeah.
And that is, I'll be quiet there. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it. We'll have time for questions for Christina at the very end. But for now, let's go ahead and introduce our next panelist, Shamika Goddard. So Shamika Goddard is passionate about people and technology. She was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, and is the oldest of 4 children. After graduating from Stanford University with a degree in African and African American Studies, she served a year with AmeriCorps in New York City. She went on to study technology and ethics by developing Techno Womanism at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York for her Master of Divinity. While at Union, she also established herself as a tech chaplain. She currently attends CU Boulder as a doctoral student in their information science department and is studying technology, ethics, and social justice issues. Shamika, welcome, and I will hand things over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm so honored to be on this panel with such wonderful people who are doing great things in this space. So I am going to share my screen here. Okay. So what I want to do with my time before we jump into the questions is just to help orient folks around the work that I'm doing right now. So I am Shamika Goddard. I'm a PhD student and an entrepreneur. I have a couple of different things that I work on. The first of which is tech chaplaincy. So when I was a seminarian in my first semester, I was helping people with their setting up their Gmail accounts. I was helping people set up their new devices and answering questions about technology, to the point where I went to the IT department to ask them if they could help me because so many people were coming to me. They offered to support me in the work that I was doing, and that's how tech chaplaincy began. I decided to approach tech support in a different way than people were used to. Oftentimes when you go to someone who is a tech expert in a particular space or in a particular way, you may be led to feel like you've done something wrong. You may be led to feel like you don't know what you're doing, or any number of things that make the experience really hectic and pressured and just not what folks deserve. So what I do with Tech Chaplaincy is center the human being in the technological crisis, and I help usher them through that moment with dignity and grace. I apply the best practices of pastoral care and chaplaincy to help replace fear and anxiety around technology with empowerment. Because I do believe that in the Christian tradition, of 2 Timothy 1:7, we have not been given a spirit of fear and timidity. And I believe that's true with technology. So Tech Chaplaincy is something that I've been working on since 2014, and I'll be launching the Tech Chaplaincy Institute officially on June 19th of this summer. The other side of the work that I do is Techno Womanism. Also in seminary, as I was incorporating technology into my vocational work and my professional work, I wanted to find a way to incorporate it into the academic work that I was doing. So around 2014, 2015 was the time of Gamergate, the time that Black Lives Matter movement was really rising. And I recognized that while I was at a social justice oriented institution, there were a lot of people there who weren't familiar with social justice issues that were occurring in and around the digital space. So I wanted to find a way to bridge that gap between social justice issues and technology. And I use ethics to do that. And the ethics that I use to do that is Techno Womanism. But before I define what Techno Womanism is, I need to first define what womanism is. So if you're not familiar with the term womanism, you may be familiar with either this quote or this author. Womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. Alice Walker. Alice Walker is an author. She wrote wonderful things like The Color Purple, but in 1983, she wrote the book In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, A Womanist Prose. And in that book, she defined the term womanist that she had been using. It's a 4-part definition, which I won't go into today, all 4 parts, but I will just distill some of the aspects of that definition. Walker defines a womanist as a Black feminist or feminist of color. A womanist loves women or men sexually or non-sexually. A womanist seeks wholeness for all, including herself. A womanist is not a separatist except for health. A womanist loves the spirit, the folk, the struggle, dancing, roundness, the moon, herself, and loves all of those things regardless. And then finally, there's the quote that I just mentioned that ends the definition, that is womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. So as a seminarian student, I was learning about Black liberation theologies, and I learned about womanism as a theology. And the late Dr. James Cone, who was teaching the systematic theology class I was taking, instructed all of us that we had a theology within us that we should explore. And for me, my theology was something that combined womanism with these social justice issues I was seeing in the digital space. So I wanted a way to take the wisdom of womanism and the Black women that were within it and apply that to those issues that were occurring there. So I came up with Techno Womanism, and I define it as an interdisciplinary womanist theoretical approach to analyzing, understanding, and explaining the intersectional nature of the human experience within and outside of the digital space, as well as in and around technology. So the talk today isn't about Techno Womanism, so I'm not going to go into this definition too much, but I will suffice to say that Techno Womanism is a way through some of the issues that we see in technology and social and the digital space with social justice. It is a lens and a framework that I'm hoping to develop through my doctoral work. So I'm looking forward to answering questions from Mandy and the questions from you all as well.
Thank you so much. So I actually do have some questions for you. Do you still see potential in technology as a liberatory force for Black and other marginalized communities? And how can those of us who work with technology and in the sector support these struggles for justice?
Absolutely, great question. So Dr. Sophia Noble, the author of Algorithms of Oppression, wrote that an app will not save us. And there's this notion that there's this techno solutionism that can happen sometimes with technology that I think that people can get wrapped up in by seeing technology as a way to fix things, and in particular fix social issues. And while it is true that there's a role that technology can play, I do believe that the larger, more long-lasting role in liberation for Black and other marginalized communities is actually people and organizations like Tohatoha that are doing the work, that are making the connections, that are doing the analysis and bringing these problems into the forefront of people's minds, and all of these different aspects. I think that some of the other writers in this space, like Dr. Sophia Noble, include Kathy O'Neill with Weapons of Math Destruction, Technically Wrong by Sarah Watcher Betcher, and then Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin. Those are just some of the things that are on my reading list this summer that I've been just sort of seeping myself in. And they have this part of the conversation where they talk about all of the issues that we're experiencing, their analysis, and then some of the ways they see forward. Some of those other ways that they see forward to support the struggle is to use your voice and your platform to help amplify and elevate the voices of marginalized communities, share their content and their causes, and learn the stories and struggles of those people, as well as do your homework about the struggle so that you aren't asking them to do it for you, and that way you can come to the table together to do the work instead of just getting caught up with them. So I like to encourage people who, for example, are interested in working against anti-Black racism. If you have that one Black person in your life that you trust to ask questions to, you may start a conversation with them about anti-Black racism, but don't just end the conversation there. Also do some legwork, do some research on your own, and then come back to them with some informed information and help move yourself forward in the process.
Yeah, no, great. To what extent do you see the generally secular culture of Silicon Valley and the world of tech as a barrier to creating welcoming spaces and communities centered around technology?
Well, what's interesting about Silicon Valley's culture, in particular the leadership that's there, oftentimes the large tech companies are run by libertarian neoliberals who present themselves as liberals until their product needs regulation. So the leadership of neoliberals in particular in the tech industry is nefarious for welcoming spaces and communities, because as Dr. Noble and Dr. Florini, who wrote Beyond Hashtags, Racial Politics and Black Digital Networks, both write about, neoliberalism shifts the conversation about race, social justice, and systemic oppression from groups and communities to individuals, and it flattens the centuries of scholarship and momentum that have been crafted in that conversation. So oftentimes the spaces that are motivated by Silicon Valley and larger tech industries to do diversity initiatives that shift the conversation from deep and lasting change to more superficial things, and they end up just putting the onus on marginalized groups to solve the issues, and we never really get around to what's really important there.
So I have heard you speak about the role of the divine in the bits and bytes of computers. If there is divinity in technology, and I would be interested to hear you answer that too, what does that say about our responsibilities around the political economy of technology?
Absolutely, great question. So I would say that as someone who believes in an entity beyond myself, something that is greater than myself, I do believe that that entity exists in the digital space, in technology. We have been created as human beings, and then we have our own creations that we create, such as devices and robots and algorithms and all of these things. So that through line of divinity is there, from the divine all the way to and through our fingertips to the things that we create. So I definitely think there is a divine presence in down to the zeros and ones in all of our technology. In terms of the political economy of technology, when you think about the interdisciplinary institutions that exist in and around technology to foster governance, law, education, commerce, and all of these things, there are power structures that are pervasively running the show, such as white supremacy, capitalism, oligarchy, plutocracy, technocracy. I could go on. But today's social media and Web 2.0 spaces are riddled with those power structures, as well as things like cyberbullying, silos, mis, dis, and malinformation, and then accounts from government actors doing nefarious things. So Ruha Benjamin calls this the new Jim Code. And there's so many other things that are happening in this space. So our responsibility should not be about the bottom line, but our responsibility should be to each other. And it reminds me of the quote, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Now, this is often attributed to the Indigenous Australian academic artist and activist Lila Watson, but she actually prefers that quote be credited to Aboriginal activist groups in Queensland from 1970s. So I would say, if there is a divine present in our technology, I believe it calls us to our highest selves in the pursuit of knowledge and the enlightenment and truth, as well as to humble ourselves to other people. So many of the world's religions share love as a central tenet, and Cornel West famously said, justice is what love looks like in public. So our technological spaces should be love forward and expressly concerned with justice for our most vulnerable people.
Excellent, thank you so much. Do you have anything else that you want to add?
Well, I'm excited to see what questions folks have brought to the table, and I'm also really eager to hear from our other panelists as well.
Excellent. So I do see that we have some questions coming in. Feel free to keep sending those and we'll have time at the end for them. But for now, I would like to hand things over and introduce our next panelist, Heeni. So Heeni Hoterene is a game-changing environmentalist and Mokopuno o Te Tiriti Watangi. She loves to cook and is an organic gardener, Mara Mataka Guru, international slow food representative, off-grid rammed earth Whare eco builder, and mama of 4, fluent in Te Reo Maori, and a follower of traditional medicine and designer of alternative curriculum. Heeni is the Wahine pioneer of Mara Mataka. Her research into the influence of Mara Mataka on human behavior has provided a pioneer model for the 4,000 practitioners she's trained. Heeni is a recognized expert, communicator at translating traditional knowledge into modern day living practices. Heeni, I invite you to take over and do your thing here.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi kia tātou, I rungi tēnei āhuatanga o te marama. Thank you, Mandy. Ngā mihi kia koe hoki, Shamika, thank you for your karakia, and also to Christina and everyone listening today. Ngā mihi, yes, my name's Heeni. That was a very flash introduction there, Mandy, and I'm quite humbled to be with you today. It's usually not a forum that I'll be present in. It's something quite new for me, but hey, this is the sign of the times. We need to be evolving. So I didn't prepare a PowerPoint. I really like to kind of just get on the vibe and go, if you like. And just listening to some of the kōrero, Shamika was talking about womanism, and for us Māori, we have a term called mana wahine, and that means power to women, and we also have a saying called mana tangata, and that means power to people, and Christina talked a lot about the role of people in determining the advancement within this technological age. And what I want to talk to you all about today is mana motuhake. Mana motuhake. And mana motuhake means independence. It means freedom from control. And I think at these particular times, it's crucial that we're able to determine our own future. Whatever, wherever we are, whatever community we're a part of, it's important that we determine our own future. So I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I'm a second language learner of Te Reo Māori. Te Reo Māori is not my first language. So I'm always in a sense of space is that, and I have many stories from within my family, within my whakapapa genealogy, of tales talking about that it's never too late to learn, So I'm always promoting the rights that we have as people, as communities, to forever strive for higher learning, for higher education. And it's quite pertinent that we're here at this particular time in Aotearoa. It is indeed our winter time. We're moving into winter. Matariki, Māori New Year, Happy New Year. And guess what? Following our Māori principles and definitions of time, we're actually moving into our new year. So in fact, we're 6 months ahead if we're following the Māori calendar. So there you go, everyone. We're 6 months ahead. So I've been brought up with a lot of old people, a lot of elderly as well. And in a crucial time that knowledge is, as us as Māori, that knowledge is just slipping through our hands. Old people are in their 80s now, the first language learners, what their traditional knowledge is, you know, we're at a point that when they die, so does a lot of our ancient knowledge. And so I've been brought up around and in a role of receiving this knowledge, and it is my purpose to share it, and not only to share it and talk about and tell stories and give examples and encourage people, but to actually interpret these stories, this knowledge, so it can be used in a modern day form to be beneficial to us in the now, now, not later, now. It needs to be beneficial. We also have a saying, he aha te mea nui o te ao, he aha te mea nui o te ao, which means what is the most important thing? It is people. It is people. So in everything I do, I'm always about considering how does this benefit the people? How does this benefit the people? Now, and in question time and later on, I think Mandy's going to ask me a few questions, so I'll relate this more to technology. But I just wanted to kind of set the theme for today and talk about the importance of knowledge, but making it relevant for the people. It has to be there to improve our lives, you know. It's not about making money. It's not about whatever else is going on. It must benefit the people. So during the lockdown here in Aotearoa, I could see that my people in particular were really struggling. We're really struggling because we didn't have control over what was going on. Things were being determined by our government. And we were never given much of a space to be active in that regard. And I could just see the helplessness. And so what I did is I started to do live broadcasts, and where I live, it's very difficult for me to even get the internet, and very difficult in other places people are. And so where I live, I managed to do a live broadcast every day. I couldn't do a pre-recording because that's too much data. And I did a live recording, and I talked about the moon phases, the maramataka. This is all traditional knowledge that I've learned, and I've applied it to a modern day context. So the maramataka Māori, it's thousands of years old. It's based on our lunar calendar, and it's mostly about the good times to fish, the good times that are most productive to garden, to plant. And what I would do on the daily is talk to people, just a short clip of 3 minutes of how we could relate maramataka and what's happening with the energy, and use it to actually settle ourselves and understand the energy within our house, because all of a sudden we're living closely together, and use traditional knowledge to benefit us. And I can talk about that more later, but that's just briefly. And just, you know, I saw immediately the response from everyone. I had 1 day off, I think, during the 40 days, and people didn't like it. They were like, we need to listen to you every morning, 7 o'clock every morning, basically giving them a kōrero, and a positive kōrero, a positive way of talking and encouraging, you know, and we need to balance out everything negative that's around us and providing positivity. So I'll give you an example. So for today, the moon is called Tamatea a Ngana, and it's actually quite an unproductive time for planting, for fishing, because we don't want to waste time, right? We don't want to waste time when we plant and when we fish. We need something to come to fruition, otherwise it's a waste of our energy. And so on tamatia, this is not actually a good moon for us to be talking. It's not a good moon for communicating. However, I'm giving up my best to put on a good show to you all today. So you might not get me straight away, but later on it might sink in. And just giving examples every day on how we can greater connect to our environment as well. And in this modern day system of time, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, it's a Gregorian time. And it actually it's not in tune with our body's energies and the environment's energies. So during winter, everything's resting. So why in winter in this country particularly is everyone out running around on the rugby field when we're most prone to injury? So this is just some facts that I use, because Maramataka is based on a science. It's the science of the moon. And this is just some examples that I use that are simple, that are practical, and I provide this information via the net. And it's just to benefit the people, and that's something that I'm all about. Yeah, so what else could I tell you? I think that's about it. That's quite simple for now. And we'll go back into, if you've got questions, do ask me. I'm just here to share. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Heeni. I really appreciate it. So you mentioned that you've been using the internet as the way in which you're sort of interfacing with your community and interacting with people since we've all been under lockdown. And one of the questions I have for you is, what do you think an internet designed for Te Ao Maori would look like? How would it be different, and how would it serve your communities? And what would an internet that supports Maori sovereignty, digital sovereignty, look like to you?
Well, number one, it'll have to be accessible and affordable. A lot of us Māori that are living in rural areas, it's not accessible. And I just, why is that? Because we're not a priority, basically, that's why. And so there's a immediate barrier in the first place established to limit us from being productive, limit us from being able to run our own home businesses, to be able to communicate on a tribal political level. It's all very restricting, and I would have to say a lot of it is purposely done. It's purposely done to inhibit our freedom of being able to determine our future, our tino rangatiratanga. So firstly, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be relevant and determined by us. I'd like to see more Māori providers involved in the whole scheme of things. We just don't really have that much of a place. So that's just something kind of straight off the cuff that I think could happen there, Mandy.
So one of the things that our organization has been involved in for a long time, as well as lots of other organizations in the sort of open world, is this idea that we're advocates for openness and sharing information freely. Can you talk a little bit about how openness doesn't necessarily serve your community, and why governance and control over Mataranga or Maori knowledge is really important to you and to your community?
I don't like to use the word governance, more so that ownership needs to remain with us, the communities that this knowledge comes from. Also, obviously Māori, within Aotearoa, we've suffered so much, and there's a real presence of mistrust. And so how can we share our information as Indigenous peoples when we actually don't trust anyone else to use it in a way that we do? Te tiriti o Waitangi, that in itself, Christina, is our document to establish our code of conduct, or our relationship agreement here in Aotearoa between Māori and Pākehā. And, we understand in this country that hasn't been honoured, that hasn't been upheld. So firstly, we need to get that right before we continue to move into the future. This is what I consider. We need to evolve, but how can we evolve when we still haven't fixed what's broken? And that's essentially what it's about. You can't move if you're not going to fix what's not working. So for me, just to, maybe you want to ask that question again, but we need to have ownership over our own information, our own mātauranga. But, you know, it's safe in the regard that for Māori, it's not individualized ownership, it's actually community ownership. And that's how we ensure there's a high level of ethics involved with those that are responsible for ensuring that the what would you say, the essence of it is maintained. And why I talked about te tiriti or waitangi is because within te tiriti it says we guarantee you undisturbed possession over your taonga, and taonga for us, your treasures, taonga means treasures, and our taonga is not only land and the environment and sea, but it's also our information, our kōrero, our whakapapa, our heritage, our people. And currently that doesn't exist within the world I'm living in, Mandy, and everyone else listening. So, you know, we must be brave, and it's no good to run off into the future if we haven't fixed what's holding us back in the past.
Yeah, excellent. Can you talk a little bit about how tikanga or Maori culture has evolved to meet the needs of hapu and whānau in digital context? So how is your culture sort of evolving to meet the needs of the digital era, both immediately in sort of the COVID times, but also more broadly in general?
Sure. Well, you know, there's been no investment really into us as people. 16 years ago, I just worked it out before, 16 years ago, I worked on a project. I come from a background of working in Māori media, and Māori radio stations were established about 35 years ago, and they are a wealth of information. You know, I had a little bit of a cry before about all our old people going. Well, a lot of our historical information has been recorded by our tribal radio stations. 16 years ago, I worked for Ngā Taonga Kōrero, which is the sound archives, and one of my role was to go out to the 22 Māori radio stations and actually just do an inventory of how much information is held there. Now, you wouldn't believe it, thousands and thousands of hours of kōrero just held on the old cassettes, and then the kind of way before my time, these big reels, pull them out and listen to them. I don't even know what they're called. And you know what? That information still has not been digitized. It's just, you know, very minute kind of token. Oh, here, we'll give you a little bit of something. Go do a scope, but then there's no follow-up. And, you know, if we had some ways of determining our own, ways to do it ourselves, we would, but we're not fully resourced. And so I still don't see that commitment, that real commitment, as just very token. Just in terms of the COVID, something that I saw that was very responsive and directed by our own communities was how we dealt with our funerals, our hui mate, our tangi, because we were limited to, I think, 5 people. Now, if you understand Māori culture, it's very important to us not only to have a send-off that's respectable to the person that has passed on, but it's so important to us to actually be there to support the deceased family. And so, you know, I don't know how many of you in the audience today have gone to a tangi, a Māori tangi, and there is nothing less of 100. You're looking at 200 to 300 to 400, 500,000 sometimes. And, you know, you could understand the hurt and the mamai that we've felt as a people not being able to attend these special occasions in person. But, you know, we sacrificed our tikanga and we evolved it. And tikanga just means the right thing to do at the right time, the right way. It's nothing mysterious. It's practical. Tikanga comes from the word tika. And we evolved, and so we had online tangi. And my children's and grandmother's sister passed away, and my 11-year-old and 10-year-old participated in that tangi, and we joined up, you know, via the internet, and my daughters got dressed up for the occasion, and we followed tikanga. We didn't eat while things were happening. The camera who was operating it at the other end, you know, didn't film the deceased, and their father sent messages, and then afterwards we finished, and we just 5 of us at home, and we had a kai together, because usually we'd return to the marae after the burial, and that's the feast is kind of brings us back into a realm of normality. And, you know, so we've had to evolve and really, really take things on. We haven't wanted to, but we've done it. Why? Again, for the benefit of the people.
Excellent. So we've actually got a question coming in that I want to go ahead and ask now live. So what political and cultural assumptions are embedded in terms like open or ownership that you can think of? And are there better terms to fit tikanga or other community needs? And I think after you answer, we'll open this up to Shamika and Christina to see if they have any thoughts on it too.
Might have to repeat that question again, thank you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So what political or cultural assumptions are embedded in key terms like open or ownership? And are there better terms that fit tikanga or other community needs? So like, are we using the wrong word?
Oh, we need a whole overhaul. You know, just the people think they have a right to information. Well, in a Māori perspective, not everyone has a right to it. You know, not everyone, and there's many different levels. You know, women's information is, some of information for women is sacred, and it just pertains to us, and we actually don't need to share it with the world. And I'm talking about not just Māori, you know, not just Māori women. And this is what I think the problem with access is, that we've thought of it as being free for all, but no, access has to benefit the person that has that knowledge, and who they want to share it with, not everyone else coming in and think they have free access. And it's this real thought, I think of it often, you know, the human ideology of thinking that we're greater than everyone else, we're greater than the environment, we can do whatever we want, there's no restrictions, there's no limitations. In fact, we need restrictions because it's about safekeeping of the people, I could explain this more and break it down, but that's my thoughts. You know, culturally, for us as Māori, even ourselves, not every Māori gets access to every bit of Māori information. There's many different levels. I come from a tribe of Ngāpuhi. I would not assume to have access over the genealogy of someone from a different tribe.
Thank you. Christina, Shamika, do you guys want to join us back in? Do you guys have any thoughts about that question? Especially the first part.
Right, about using the wording, so open versus ownership. Well, the first thing that came to mind is I remember being, when I was younger, hearing about how there are certain Indigenous communities who think of ownership differently in the way that maybe capitalistic societies think of ownership. So thinking that you can own land, thinking that you can own natural resources, like that's something that doesn't really jive with certain groups of people, and that's something that I can recognize and resonate with. So in terms of like ownership over digital spaces, or ownership over content, or ownership over like all of these different things, like I agree with, is it Heeni? Heeni, thank you. I agree with what you're saying about how there's different needs for different groups of people and different individuals that need to be taken into consideration, and that there's definitely room for improvement in the words that we're using and the connotations that those words have grown with over time.
Excellent. Christina, any thoughts?
Not a whole lot to add, but I would point out that yeah, the conceptions, I'm sort of building on what Shamika and Heeni have said, the conceptions of openness and ownership, property, you know, are located within a framework that is, you know, liberal, enlightenment, masculine, Western, these things, and they're about, you know, a free individual human, and, you know, only certain categories of humans have been allowed to enter into that relationship with the world and that sort of contract with others. And yeah, the sort of post-humanist and racial and gender critiques, we need all of them, and we need to sort of be thinking with them all the time. And it's, you know, not a coincidence that that slide, that the only slide that I showed that had people in it, you know, it was 5 white men. I actually realized I misnamed one of them, but moving on. And then the provisional movement of that is to add white women, right? And that is not necessarily the right way to approach this project at all. But second of all, I would just sort of underscore that there are these, yes, liberal Western selfhood, citizenship, ownership, property relationships embedded in even these framings of these topics. And so we can all, unpack that in all of these myriad different ways, which I think is incredibly important. So
yeah,
thank you.
definitely.
Yeah.
Do you guys, before we go into the Q&A, and go ahead and start typing your questions now, folks. We'll have, we should have a good amount of time for them. Do any of the panelists have questions for other panelists? Shamika, I see you nodding.
Pardon me. Yes, Christina, I was actually gonna connect with you about your work, and just to say it's really interesting, and some of the threads that you have in your work are run alongside some of my own research interests, and I'd be really interested to hear more about, for example, how your work intersects with Angela Davis and other Black feminists or potential womanist figures.
Yeah, let me collect my thoughts for a second. I definitely am leaning on some of that tradition to, think through how people are, differently situated in a matrix of domination or in an intersectional framework. And I think that I see actors in my story trying to take some of that up too, and I'm also sort of talking about those frameworks and trying to do that. And certainly it's really important to recognize that, how people are situated and how they are located gives different, not just sort of ideas, but experiences and sort of embodied knowledges about the society or pluralistic societies that we live in. And so we really, really need to be inclusive, in those perspectives, but also using that to shift power relationships is, really, really important. And again, I see a sort of place where some of this can kind of get like picked up, but not taken all the way, especially in tech discourses. It could be anything from sort of, oh, we need more diverse workers. And then it's like, oh, we need more diverse management. But, oh, like, really, do we need to be sort of going all the way up and thinking about the sort of violence of, capitalism and colonialism and tech's role in that? So I think that those thinkers can help bring some of that out. I'm really situated in social studies of technology in my work, not to get too jargony. But another thing that I've sort of idiosyncratically perhaps done is bring together sort of genealogies of hacking with some of these discussions about different subject positions. And for example, there's a book by Rayvon Fouché about the history of Black inventors. And he points out that African-American who submitted a patent application for a kind of rake for hay was denied a patent on the basis that a Black man couldn't be a patent holder because it wasn't an act of ingenuity. And so the very category of who's a hacker or who's a technical agent is embedded with race, class, and gender from the very get-go. And this is earlier than computing too. We'd want to look, in the sort of moment that technology in the Western culture where I live sort of leaps from being a sort of pokey term describing mechanical arts to a bigger sort of keyword concept in our culture, and who's anointed with the sort of power to have agency and to be inventive and to be ingenious and to not be criminalized in that domain is really, really important. And that's really feeding into, who's participating in technical cultures now, who's being celebrated, who's being given the, you know, sort of wand of wizardry, the sort of bearer of the magic of this tech. And yeah, for me, I can't think about this stuff without bringing together these sort of threads of social theory and also the sort of history and sociology of technology. I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope it does.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much. That's incredible.
So we've got a lot of questions coming in. If the panelists want to take a peek at the Q&A, we've got one from Jad Alexander that I think might be good for one of our two American panelists. I suspect Heeni may not have a ton of it. Well, actually, I suspect you have a lot of opinions about what Donald Trump has done, but probably not a lot of opinions about Section 203, which is what this is about. Do either of you want to give that one a take?
Oh, you're muted, Christina.
Oh, yep, you're muted.
Oh,
I was muttering that I was just rereading it. So,
oh,
sorry. Shamika, did you have?
I only just barely heard this news as I was preparing for the talk today and finalizing my remarks. So I'm not intimately familiar with the details. But what I can say is just the little bit of information that I know of after having a couple of tweets sort of marked as misguided. Now this sort of action has been taken. So it's par for the course for this particular individual, so to speak. And it's unfortunate that we're in the predicament that we're in. But yeah, I'm looking forward to getting more details and finding out what actually is going on with that.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add either about the specific measure, other than to just sort of point to people who are more versed in this than I am, who are thinking about the role of the platforms in the sort of journalistic space. You know, we need to think about First Amendment and free speech. We need to think about journalism, ownership, whether or not these are providing public utilities and should be regulated, you know, one way versus whether they're private for-profit corporations. I'll also add, I ironically barely used social media before the pandemic. So I don't have a long-standing relationship to this. I can't tell if you're asking about sort of social groups of society writ large or us individually. But yeah, I think it's a complicated area. I think some of it, as is often the case with this, I like that you called him a particular individual, is about diversion and spectacle, and I'm not going to worry too much about the substance of that order right this minute, I think.
Yeah, and I would actually sort of emphasize that this is a policy question. To the extent that there might be some policy content that someone wrote up for him and he has now signed, I don't think that we should engage with it from a policy perspective at all. I think that we should treat it as the abuse of power it is, and the question of whether or not it happens to have been a thing that many of us, and I'm one of them, have thought perhaps might be something worth organizing around and worth developing a good, coherent, solid policy around. This is not that. This is an abuse of power by that individual and should be treated as such. We don't want to misinterpret him as an ally in any way whatsoever. So we do have more questions coming in. Kay asks, how can we respectfully challenge biased language and concepts? For example, I find guys sexist and excluding, but others don't see it that way. Would anyone like to respond to that?
I can certainly jump in really quickly just to say I appreciate this sentiment. I feel the same way about referring to grown adult women as girls. That's very belittling. And there's lots of, like we were talking about before with language needing an overhaul, there's lots of words and turns of phrases and colloquialisms that exist that are diminutive and demeaning and denigrating. And you have to keep bringing it up to people and explaining the situation and putting it into context for people to understand maybe what the historical issue is. Or I heard it, or I saw it said online, when you have someone who has an issue with the term guys, for example, if it's a heterosexual straight male, you could say, so you sleep with a lot of guys? Because they think, oh, guys can refer to both genders or all people, but then once you put it in context like that, then they might find issue with it. So it was a humorous way of really bringing home the point that if you have a term that is offensive, but it's not offensive to a group that you identify with, then you put it into context that that person can understand, that brings it into relief for them.
Anyone else want to add anything?
Oh, well, I just think it shows, you know, lack of respect. And so whoever you're communicating with, you have to, you know, we wouldn't mispronounce someone's name. Surely, you know, if you can't pronounce it properly, it means you don't really care. And that's how simple it is. Interesting for Māori. I talked about this yesterday in my live, so we must get things right. So koro means old man to other tribes here in Aotearoa, but to my tribe, koro means young man. So often we have people visiting from other tribes and they'll talk to an elder and greet him and say, kia ora e koro, and it's a bit offensive to the elder, but we think, well, look, they don't know, so we try not to take offense. And then it's not the elder's role to correct them, it's our role to correct them. So think about who else is in the room that perhaps could whakatika here and correct. And also, you know, that things such as names, I mean, like definitions, Mr., Mrs., girl, boy. In Māori society, traditionally, we're all known as our actual name. We've only used these other terms of reference when we've become colonized. So we're known by our names, and because our names hold so much meaning, we're named after people, we're named after events. And so it would be very disrespectful to not say the name properly. And that's what I think, you know, we need to move more towards, not defining people as girl, boy, Mr., Mrs., but their names.
Yeah. So to move on to the next question, Keitha asks, hi Keitha, are there international examples of terms that replace open or ownership that could be considered in Aotearoa? And I would probably extend that to their terms in Te Reo that could be considered for here in New Zealand. Heeni, do you want to
have a term like that? Because again, what Shamika was referring to, everything's owned by the collective. But the greatness of that is then the collective all benefit together in the ownership. You know, we all gain prosperity and value together. And then it's also the collective's duty to make sure it's looked after properly, you know, so it doesn't rest on one, but we don't have individual ownership, it's owned by everyone, and this is traditionally. And so we really need to kind of get past a lot of these, you know, embrace the opportunity that we have to actually use some of these indigenous frameworks that, you know, if we're defining things, let's use indigenous frameworks as a reference point. Exciting.
Yeah, so go beyond language to really address the sort of underlying frameworks that are defining this. Shamika or Christina, do either of you have anything you want to add?
No, I think that was very well said.
Yeah, I think that was really well said too. I like collective, I like relational, you know, thinking through things in relation and not being, you know, absolute categories or universal categories are still always situated. So, you know, just sort of drawing that out. Thank you.
So Michelle asks, are there strong examples of more mainstream tech projects that have been particularly good at incorporating justice perspectives into their structures? Wondering about highly interactive and collaborative platforms like Wikipedia as possible references for how to see possible manifestations of this work happening at scale. And then Michelle adds, Also, any thoughts about bridging collaboration across languages, drawing from a justice perspective? And Michelle says, thanks so much to all the panelists for sharing so many great insights. Who wants to respond to that one?
I do know that in Race After Technology, Ruha Benjamin highlights a project called Appalition, like abolition, an app put together. And it's an app where, similar to some of these money-saving apps where you sign up and every time you pay for something, it'll round it up and it'll put the change in your savings account. Well, Appalition, instead of putting that change in your savings account, it gives that money to an organization that helps free people, free Black people who can't afford to make bail. So it is a way that technology is being used to actively work against the prison industrial complex to literally free Black individuals who are trapped in that system. So that's just it's a small, well, not small, it's actually gotten a lot of really great response and people participating in it, but it's not as large as Wikipedia, but it is an example of how people are baking justice into the design process from beginning to end with their technology.
Excellent. Anyone else want to comment on any ideas that they might have? Perfect. So let me make sure that I am in the right spot. So Casey asks, one of the big principles of open spaces is, as you said, the libertarian, small L-ness of it, but this attitude is often used by tech creators to absolve themselves of responsibility for what their tech is used for. Do you feel that creators of open tech have a responsibility to ensure their tech isn't used for harmful purposes? How do we reconcile open creation with social responsibility? That's a really great question. Christina, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, I could try. This is hard. I'm trying not to soapbox too much. I think open creators do have a responsibility, but I also want to sort of zoom out from, again, individuals and think about structure. One of the things that people in the sort of field and role where I sit are sort of concerned about with some of the conversations about like tech ethics right now is that sometimes those conversations can get collapsed into, again, kind of thinking about individuals maybe interacting with individuals and not a sort of legacy of history and collectivities and, you know, a unit of social groups who have maybe been harmed by technology or could potentially be harmed. And, you know, the field in which I have a doctorate is called Science and Technology Studies, and that is, you know, social and cultural studies of science and technology, like in society. And that's different than ethics. And our relevant sort of unit of analysis is groups, not individuals. And so I think creators have responsibilities, but sometimes these problems are just bigger than individual people's or small like-minded collectivities of people. So I also think there are places for regulation. There are places for, I don't know, I'd love to hear about like a community board or something to sort of really weigh in and be a part of governance and a part of accountability. You know, what are the social relations and the values that you want to build for, you know, would be the first questions, and then the app or whatever that you build is second, I think, is how I would answer that. But yeah.
Any thoughts from Heeni or Shamika?
I just, you know, as I've listening to some of the questions and the dialogue, what keeps coming to me is, can technology be sacred? You know, that's for me, it's like, is it sacred? Is there, can we regulate it, and for what reason? But I think that's often a question we don't ask ourselves, and if it's not, perhaps we may need to make aspects of it, you know, restricted. So for us here in Aotearoa, we have tapu and noa, so things that are noa, ordinary, everyday, things that are sacred, are special, so such as our tangi, you know, we wouldn't I gave our example before of our funerals, we wouldn't film the deceased. That's sacred. And perhaps we need to ask ourselves some of these questions around sacredness and the space of tech. What does that look like?
Absolutely. I completely agree. As someone who has been talking about technology and theology for years with my cohort at my seminary and other faith leaders and communities here in the United States, it's a conversation that there was a space for as a digital minister, which there weren't a lot of play for digital ministers up until about a few months ago. And suddenly faith spaces were having to figure out, how do we do what we do in the digital space without the building, without the various aspects of our physical liturgy. And so for people like myself and people like Reverend Jim Keed and the E-Formation Learning Center, we have been providing resources for people on how to figure out what to do in the digital space. And a lot of people think, well, the digital space, it's not real. You know, what happens there is not the same as the offline space. Well, digital isn't the opposite of real, it's the opposite of physical. That's something that Reverend Jim Keat says, and I think it's very important for us to be asking these kinds of questions, like, how can we make this digital space sacred? We've spent thousands of years figuring out how to make our physical spaces sacred, and only a few decades, maybe a couple of years, thinking about how to make the digital space sacred. So it's going to take time, it's going to take thought, effort, and energy, and forward motion as well to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I think it's also about us wanting to avoid accountability as well, you know, thinking that we can just, you know, where's the accountability to our participation?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you both. That was wonderful. So Nina asks, do you think that jargon, especially tech jargon, the deliberate use of less well-known or academic language, plays a role in excluding people from the tech community? And the prevalence of English and inability to code macrons and other non-Roman alphabets, Namihi. So what do you guys think about that?
I think that jargon doesn't necessarily inhibit people from participating in tech communities or tech spaces, because people will find spaces that make sense for them and work for them and where they are and what their tools and resources and devices are. But I do think that there's definitely a lot of room to grow in terms of moving past English as the standard, because there's so many other languages in the world that people are using in the digital space, and the way that we encode the language, because a lot of the encoding happened with English first, it sort of had to augment itself to accommodate other languages, as opposed to thinking about, well, how do we fit this other language into the system we already have, similar to what Christina has been talking about. How can we change the whole framework and perspective to say, how can we accommodate any language? How can we accommodate anything, and just like really open it up and make it a different space?
Any other comments? Okay, so Daniel asked, Tina Koehine, do you see a place for Maramataka in software development, for example, in planning IT projects?
Definitely. So that is the value of what I teach everyone, is that we need to use our traditional knowledge to plan. Part of our colonization has been, we've just been told to go with the flow, you know, but going with the flow does not create a survivor, you know. And yeah, so I'm really interested in that space at the moment, because again, it's ensuring access. I provide a lot of workshops online. This is some of my resources here. I'm looking at the energies and planning forward around our lunar cycle. I'm working with all kinds of groups at the moment, not only community, but government organizations are quite interested in adopting this for their maramataka, for their framework. So I'm really keen to collab. Again, it's, you know, what Māori communities are in that space to collab with. The reality is not many at the moment. So we have all of this knowledge, we want to share it, but there's also, we need another step towards getting there. So yeah, definitely.
Excellent, thank you. Our time is actually drawing to a close. I wanted to thank our panelists so much for being here today, and for sort of sharing your ideas and your thoughts and your work with us. It's so meaningful and valuable for us to be able to come together and talk and share ideas like this, especially outside of a university setting where I think a lot of this happens, but to be able to do it as part of civil society and as our role as participants in a democracy. So thank you, all of you, for being here today and for participating in this. And thanks to Internet New Zealand for making this possible. This is real, genuine intellectual work that these women have been doing for us, and they've been compensated for it, which means so much, I think, to all of us to recognize the value of that work. And that couldn't happen without Internet New Zealand. So thank you to Internet New Zealand for all of your support for New Zealand civil society. And thank you to our participants today for joining us. I hope that you've learned something today, and I hope that you've enjoyed this event. Shamika, I would like to hand it, oh, wait, hold on. I would also like to remind you to follow Tohatoha NZ on Twitter, as well as to subscribe to our newsletter, join Tohatoha, and donate to support our work so that we can continue doing it. There will be a post-event survey. There should be a link coming out in the chat. You will also see it when you close down Zoom. Please fill that out and let us know what you liked about this, what you think we could do differently, and any other thoughts you have. It's really meaningful to me if you just take a few moments and fill that out. And finally, I'll hand it over to Shamika to do our final blessing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for this opportunity. So, restrictions are moved aside, so the pathways is clear to return to everyday activities.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to stop the recording now.